All right, Alexander, let's cover the Putin Annual Q&A event. Now, last year this event was canceled because of the coup, but this year it was on. And Putin does this every year, and he fields questions from Russian citizens by SMS, by internet, telephone, social media. He gets a variety of questions, and he answers them. Very simple. A lot of it focuses on Russian domestic policy and what's going on in Russia, because these are Russian citizens who are asking questions about their country, their city, their hometown, etc. But in these Q&As, there's always very interesting remarks from Putin regarding various questions on foreign policy. And there were some doozies in this one, I have to admit. Get into some of the comments he made about the recent events in the Black Sea, Alexander. And what I thought was the best quote of the event, and I'll read it out to you. You can comment on that as well, which is when he was talking about Ukraine, and Putin said, quote, they asked him, why don't you meet with Zelensky? And Putin said this: why meet with Zelensky if he has let his country fall under full outside control? Decisions on key issues about Ukraine's livelihood are being made not in Kiev, but in Washington, and partly in Berlin and in Paris. So what is there to talk about? An incredible quote.
An absolutely incredible quote. Can I just say, general, I mean, the general pattern of these live streams, where, as you rightly said, that he does two usually a year. One is with the media. One is where he takes questions from ordinary Russian citizens. This was of the second. It was taking questions from ordinary Russian citizens. They send SMSs, they send emails, they send phone-ins, all kinds of things of that kind. Apparently 2 million questions this year. And obviously there were questions about domestic policy, about the pandemic, about inflation, which is obviously a big topic. But actually, foreign policy was much more important than usual. And that was really very interesting. I mean, it was a much more engaged on foreign policy than I've seen for a very long time. And the thing that came across to me straightforwardly, listening to Putin, is firstly, he feels extremely confident now. He feels that, the Russians have turned the corner, that they're militarily strong enough to deal with any challenge that's thrown at them by the West. And he's taking a very hard line. And, he took a very hard line on the Black Sea, extremely hard line on the Black Sea. He made it very clear that as far as the Russians are concerned, they could have blown up that British warship. The West would not have been able to do anything. I mean, they wouldn't have dared start World War III, because that would have ended in their own destruction. And though he didn't actually say so, any economic sanctions, Russia now is in a position to brush off. So he was extremely hard line on the Black Sea. He was extremely tough on Ukraine. And, he spoke about Ukrainians and Russians being essentially one people, something which, of course, some people in Ukraine take great offence to, but he said that they're basically one people, and made it fairly clear that he expects one day that they'll all come back together again in some form, not necessarily in one state, but as a sort of, friendly countries growing back together again. And he made that incredibly tough comment about Zelensky. And, of course, the implication of that comment, which you just said, is not just that there's no point in purpose in meeting with Zelensky, but that Zelensky isn't really in control of Ukraine. That people who run Ukraine are in Washington and Berlin to some extent, and perhaps also in Brussels. But certainly Zelensky isn't in charge, and Zelensky really has nothing to say to him. Now, the point to get about that is that Zelensky, ever since the events of April of this year, when he sent all those troops to the ceasefire line, where they still are, by the way, and apparently becoming increasingly demoralized with lots of desertion and problems happening, when he sent all those troops to the ceasefire line, and then found that he couldn't launch his offensive, and when he also found that his NATO allies weren't really backing him, he's been pushing hard for a summit meeting with Putin. And what Putin has said is, look, I'm not interested in talking to you. you've got absolutely nothing to say. You have nothing to say of any use or importance to me, because as far as I'm concerned, you're not really in charge of your own country. And the implication of that is that the tensions between Russia and Ukraine are not tensions between the peoples of these countries, because the peoples of these countries are essentially one people. They have been manufactured by outside, and it's Washington that really is controlling things in Ukraine. So it's humiliation for Zelensky, a humiliation for Ukrainian nationalists, who he obviously loathes, but also, I have to say this straightforwardly, a statement of the obvious. I mean, nobody really believes that Ukraine is truly in charge of its foreign policy anymore. And just to finish on this, I just did a program about how Ukraine did a switch of its votes at the Human Rights Council. It initially backed a US resolution criticising China at the UN Human Rights Council, and then reversed itself. Apparently, this came after a threat from Beijing to Kiev that if they didn't do that, then China would take retaliatory action against Ukraine in all kinds of ways, including in terms of pandemic help. And Ukraine is in such a brittle and fragile state that it can't even argue with Beijing. So it can't argue with anybody. It has no mind of its own. It's not in a position to take any strong action on any topic. So there we are. That is what Putin had to say about Ukraine. And it also, by the way, shows the centrality of Ukraine as far as the Russians are concerned in determining their policy with the West.
Yeah, there was a point in time where Putin looked like he was preparing for his successor. He looked a little tired, I have to admit, and his heart wasn't into it. And during the Q&A, he did say that it seems that he has a successor in mind, but he did say that that successor, he would act as a mentor to that person when and if that person is made known. But he also said that it's up to the Russian people to decide if that's going to be the person that's going to be president. In other words, the Russians are going to go to the polls and they'll decide if that person is going to be president. But around, say, the beginning to the midterm of Trump's presidency, it did look like Putin was ready to move on. And we were entering the age of Trump, like a Trump style of leadership, a different type of politician. But then Russiagate was going on, and the impeachment with Ukraine, and of course Joe Biden. And now it looks like Putin is back and more energetic than ever. I mean, he is in top form, it seems. And I've never seen in my life, I've only known two politicians in my life that I've ever seen that can actually talk to the public for 2, 3, 4 hours. One of them is Vladimir Putin, who does it in a very professional manner. And the other one is Donald Trump, who feeds off of the energy of the crowd and is more go with the flow type of politician. But I've never in my life seen a politician do what those two men do.
Absolutely, that's entirely correct. Can I just go quickly to the question of the succession? I think Putin fully intended to retire at the end of this term, up till about the start of last year. And then I think he saw the way that things were going in the United States. And I think not just he, but also the other people in the political establishment around him in Moscow. And they said, with the situation in the United States going the way it is, this is simply not the time to risk a transition. We need to convey to the Americans the appearance of strength and stability and unity in our government. We can't have a new and untested leader taking on the neocons who seem to be coming back. So that was why I think in March last year they switched policies, because they could see the drift that ended up with the outcome of the election in the United States, and with Joe Biden becoming president, and with all sorts of neocons coming. And bear in mind, At the moment, we've had the summit meeting, which Putin, by the way, was very dismissive about, his summit meeting with Biden. He clearly doesn't have many high hopes of it. So that was another thing that came across very clearly from this Q&A. But it's important to remember that at the start of this year, all the talk that was coming out of Washington was of war. We were going to have more sanctions and more pressure. And of course, all this happened with the deployment of troops to Ukraine's ceasefire line. So, it looked as if some big showdown was taking place, but Putin was still there. Putin made it absolutely clear he's not a lame duck. He acted to block it. And that's why we've seen a certain very fragile and very unstable, shall we say, thaw in the relationship, which nobody, I think, expects is going to continue for very long. So that was why it happened. I think it was connected to political events in the United States. You're quite right. He clearly does have somebody in mind. I mean, he made that perfectly clear today, in his Q&A. And I think that once he feels he can go, he will. I think that is his last big legacy to the Russian people will be to organise a stable transition to a handpicked successor. That's, I think, who the Russian people will then be invited to endorse. But that was clearly what that was all about. Now, you're absolutely right that Putin is the only world leader at the moment who's able to talk to people of his own country in this kind of way. And you're also absolutely right that Donald Trump is also able to speak to the American people in ways that no other political leader in the United States can, and can remotely. But the reason that is so is because both Putin and Trump are real politicians. In other words, they are real people. They are not just party hacks. If you look at the kind of people who are floating up to power everywhere in the West now, they're not the kind of politicians that I remember. They're not people like de Gaulle or Adenauer or Helmut Schmidt or whomever. They are just people who rise up through the political system and simply take their places one after the other. So that's what sets Putin and Trump apart from everyone else, that they are actually connected to the nations and the political life of their nations in a way that political leaders in the West no longer are. And that makes them unique. And you're quite right to say that it's different. Putin is a very structured person. He speaks very clearly. He has the gift of explaining complicated things in a very simple, clear language, but in a very structured way. It's always important to remember, by the way, as a legal training, and that's something that legal training teaches you to do. Trump, as you rightly say, feeds off people, and a lot of it comes across as being very improvised, and some people will make use of that to distort the meaning of Trump's words, something that goes on all the time, by the way. But again, each of them able to communicate to their own people in ways that no one else can, because they're genuine politicians and because of something else, which is that they like their people. Putin likes talking to Russians. Trump likes talking to Americans. Most political leaders don't want to have anything to do with the people that they're supposed to be representing because they don't have anything in common with them, and you feel that in more cases than not, they don't like them. Wasn't Hillary Clinton a person who once called a large part of the American population deplorables?
Yes, she did. And, well, Putin has called Zelensky essentially a puppet, which is not false. I mean, he said it in a much nicer, more diplomatic manner, but it's spot on.
He chose his words carefully, but I mean, what he said was pretty brutal, actually.
Okay, so he's called Zelensky a puppet. Joe Rogan on his podcast the other day basically just came out and said that Biden has no idea what the hell he's doing. I mean, I don't know the exact quote from Joe Rogan, but he said, you know, we really don't have a leader in the White House. We really don't have a president. Biden has no idea what's going on. I mean, that's the most popular, the most famous podcast in the world. And he's coming out and saying, and he's not even on a conservative right. You know, I would say he's more libertarian than anything. And he's like, look, let's not fool ourselves anymore. We really don't have a leader. You have in Europe a dynamic where Merkel is on her way out. Macron is finito. It seems like they're pushing Netherlands' Rutte forward to kind of be an EU spokesperson. So, I mean, they're kind of searching for that next Merkel type of figure to start, you know, talking about the glories of the European Union on the world stage. It looks like Rutte right now, but I don't know. Maybe that'll change. We've got some interesting results going on in the polling in Sweden. Of course, we've talked about Italy. We've talked about Spain and the rise of some sort of libertarian conservative movement there as well. My point on all of this is that, you know, like without Putin, love him or hate him, without Putin, you would not have stability in the world in a geopolitical level. And I really think that is a fact, is that people like Putin and Trump, even if you disliked them, they were strong enough to put the brakes on the neocons and the neoliberal march to war. And in Trump, you saw it over and over. He was goaded many times to start a conflict in Syria. He would always contact the Russians and liaise with the Syrians and do some sort of maneuver, which was well planned to make sure that the damage was minimal. We saw it with Soleimani, and something happened there, but Trump got on the line with the Iranians and they managed to figure out an off-ramp there. And we've got many examples with Putin stepping in and doing the same thing. My point is that there's no leadership anywhere. And those were the two men that were kind of keeping, you know, the whole world away from a complete, you know, run into some sort of world war, some sort of chaos. And Putin pretty much said it with his Black Sea statement as well.
Oh. Absolutely, that's exactly right. Because, of course, look, we had a summit meeting a few days, 10 days ago in Geneva. We have the Americans, or at least parts of the administration, talking about predictable and stable relations with Russia. What do immediately after that? Firstly, they say that they're working on another, bunch of sanctions, that they're going to sanction Russia even more. And now they hold this incredibly provocative and reckless exercise in the Black Sea directly after the British and the Dutch, by the way. I'm glad you mentioned Rutte, because, of course, we've had the Dutch frigate sailing around the Black Sea, also getting itself into all kinds of trouble. So they hold on this huge exercise in the Black Sea, which is, again, I mean, does the diametric opposite. It doesn't create for predictability and stability in the Black Sea or anywhere else. It's clearly designed to provoke. So, I mean, whatever, the man in the White House, the old man in the White House, thinks he may be saying when he talks about predictability and stability, the facts on the ground point in the diametrically opposite direction. And you're absolutely right. When there was, I mean, for me, the classic one was the one that arose after this, Soleimani got killed, was that there was a situation where it did look as if, briefly, there might be an armed clash between the US and Iran. And, you remember that the Iranians launched missile strikes at US bases. But in private, Trump, and we know this, Trump acted behind the scenes. He established an off-ramp. He established a back channel to the leadership in Tehran through various intermediaries. And he agreed with Switzerland. It was Switzerland. Yeah. It was Switzerland. And it was agreed that the US troops would remain in their barracks and the Iranians would make sure that the missiles hit basically empty dust. So, it would show that, the Iranians have the capability, but no Americans would be killed, and the whole situation would be kept under control. That's the kind of thing, by the way, that, someone like JFK used to do. Kennedy, when he was locked in confrontation with the Soviets, he was able to negotiate through back channels with the Russians, with Khrushchev, and solve the Cuban Missile Crisis in that way. Can you ever imagine Biden doing something like that? Inconceivable. And that makes for a far more dangerous situation, because Biden can come along, say, I want better relations, I want predictable and stable relations with you, and the machine carries, the war machine goes clanking on exactly as always. They send their ships to the Black Sea, they carry out more exercises in the Baltic, they deploy their troops in Europe. Merkel floats the idea of a summit meeting with Putin, and she can't get it past even, someone like Rutte, for God's sake, who's the leader of a small country. I mean, Netherlands is no great power. Let's be quite clear about this. But they can't even agree on that. So, ultimately, in this kind of situation, there is no one in charge. We discussed this before. We discussed this at we were talking about this a lot some months ago. The fundamental problem with this administration is that it is weak at the centre. There is no one in charge, and people are pulling in different directions all the time, so that, you have some people who say, let's pull out of Afghanistan. There are other people who want to pull back into Afghanistan. You have some people who say, we want predictable and stable relations with Russia and Europe so that we can focus on China instead. And now we have these exercises in the Black Sea. And that wasn't the case with strong leaders in the past, like Khrushchev and JFK, or Putin and Trump. But today, Putin is prepared to talk to the Europeans. The Europeans can't bring themselves together to talk to him. And he meets with Biden in Geneva, and Biden says one thing, and what happens is the opposite.
Yeah. Real quick, who do you think is the second most powerful person right now in Russia? Who's a possible successor? If you had to pick one or two names, who would it be?
Well, it's very difficult. One person whom I've
just off the top, it's not a prediction.
Yeah, I was going to say,
thoughts, yeah.
No, it's not a prediction. It seems to me that at the moment the two rising men are Sergei Shoigu, who is the defense minister, who's been very, very close to Putin recently, who's extremely able technocrat and manager, and who is very popular in the country. So that's one person. The only thing that works against him is he's a little on the old side. He's in his late 60s, but okay. The other one is the Prime Minister, Mishustin, who is another younger but very, very able technocrat, and somebody who's exceptionally tech savvy also. I mean, he's very into digitalization and understands all the things about digital currencies and blockchains and all those things. He's very, very up to speed with all of that. So I would say it's one of those two, most likely. I wouldn't like to put my money on which one. I suspect it will depend a lot on the international situation. If things are tense, then it could be Shoigu. If things are more stable internationally, and they want to focus more on internal things, it could be Mishustin. But one or the other, that's my guess.
All right, we'll leave it there. Let us know who you guys think is going to be in the comments down below, or who you think is the front runner, say, to succeed Putin. We'll leave it there, Alexander. And guys, go to our locals, support us on locals. It really helps us out a lot. YouTube they really fight us all the time. They fight our progress, and then they impede our progress all the time. So the best thing to do is to support us on locals, support us on Super U, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off when you make a purchase at the Duran shop. Awesome magic mugs in my Mexico mug right here.
Mexico. Amazing flag, by the way.
Yeah, Mexico has a beautiful flag.
Yeah,
I've always loved the eagle with the snake. Very, very good flag. Aztec origins. that flag
Absolutely.
is.
Yeah. No.
Absolutely. All right, we'll leave it there. Take care, everybody.